Hello there, my name is Kella and I work for the Norwegian Refugee Council as an Information, Counseling and Legal Assistance Officer. I will take you through this tutorial on understanding displaced women's access to housing, land and property. During conflict and displacement, women face exacerbated discrimination as women, as internally displaced persons, as refugees, as poor people, and as members of ethnic or religious minorities. In displacement settings, women find it particularly difficult to claim their rights on housing, land, and property, commonly abbreviated as HLP, due to poverty, limited access, low literacy levels, male-dominated traditions, and harmful cultural practices. The protection of displaced women's HLP rights is essential to fostering the realization of other related human rights such as the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to live free from violence and discrimination, and the right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. With this in mind, this tutorial focuses on 3 areas. First, the legal basis of displaced women's HLP rights. Second, the shifting gender dynamics and new realities faced by displaced women. And lastly, practical actions aimed at increasing women's access to their HLP rights. To begin with, the primary basis of HLP rights for women can be found in several sources, including statutory, customary, and religious regimes. Some key international and regional instruments worth mentioning here include the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the Kampala Convention, the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, and lastly, the Pinheiro Principles and the Interagency Standing Committee Framework on Durable Solutions for Internally Displaced Persons. In Sub-Saharan Africa, women's access to housing and land is contingent on family and lineage structures, the strength of customary norms and practices, enforced legislation, and whether women themselves have actively organized on these issues. Discriminatory traditional and cultural practices contribute to violence against women and often limit them from exercising control over their housing and land. At the same time, some national laws and the legal systems act as barriers for women's ability to exercise their rights. One common example is the lack of civil documentation such as personal identity documents and marriage certificates, which is particularly complex for displaced women accessing the formal justice system. In displacement settings, when most men are uprooted from their rural environment, they frequently lack the skills to adapt to urban employment, whereas women are seen as more employable for the available jobs. As a result, women become less dependent on men for access to economic resources. Likewise, displaced men become renters and are no longer in control of their land or home. In this context, women's economic empowerment is difficult to accept by husbands who invoke religion and traditional customs to assert their control over women's earnings. Such disputes within the household can lead to violence and divorce. Additionally, with men being recruited into armed groups and more likely to be killed by the conflict, there are higher numbers of female-headed households and widows who face additional barriers to access land and housing. In instances where they are able to access these, they are of lower quality and face major obstacles to securing those rights against infringement and arbitrary extinguishment. Widowed women, for example, typically face difficulties in transferring property rights from their deceased husbands or relatives to themselves due to several factors, from missing documents to harmful cultural practices, among others. We must also bear in mind that the effects of conflict are gendered, and the lack of adequate housing during displacement can increase the exposure to key protection risks such as sexual and gender-based violence. Displaced women face multiple layers of vulnerabilities, including exploitation by unscrupulous landlords, the threat of forced evictions, and a sense of disempowerment due to regressive social attitudes linked to the exercise of control over land and housing. This is aggravated by the fact that during displacement, women and girls live in disrupted and uncertain environments where traditional protection mechanisms no longer exist. Furthermore, they have limited access to formal and informal justice systems due to the high costs of pursuing formal courts and the discriminatory nature of customary and religious dispute resolution mechanisms. In displacement contexts, HLP programming can thereby create an opportunity to promote durable solutions by supporting women in claiming and defending their HLP rights. Some key actions that aim to protect and promote women's HLP rights include incorporating gender-sensitive analysis into the design of programs. It is important to analyze and understand how interventions will be perceived by and impact both men and women. Actors should be cautious that the advancement of women is not seen as coming at the expense of men. Strengthening women's access to justice. This requires a combination of short-term and long-term interventions targeting men and women and decision-makers at customary, religious, and statutory levels. Local women's organizations are usually the most effective advocates for changes, but often lack financial resources to do so. These changes, brought by urban displacement, can also provide a window of opportunity to progressively influence behavioral changes in a way that is more equitable to women if they are adequately supported. Operationalizing the humanitarian development peace-building nexus. Humanitarian interventions are mostly short-term and cannot influence the social, structural, and institutional issues that are at the root of women's housing and land issues. Humanitarian actors should share their experience and knowledge with development and peace-building actors so that corrective action can be integrated into rule of law or land governance programs. In parallel, improved urban planning and governance will not only improve living conditions through better access to housing and services, but it will also offer more livelihood opportunities not directly linked to the possession of land. And in conclusion, advocating for the development of laws and policies addressing discriminatory norms and practices infringing women's HLP rights. To access more resources on housing, land and property, please visit the Norwegian Refugee Council website at www.nrc.no or the Global Protection Cluster website at www.globalprotectioncluster.org. This tutorial is funded by the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives.